Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today we are going to do a discussion on 23rd January, the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, a quick reminder to all of you, if you are somebody who is looking to prepare for this examination and you need some kind of guidance, you can always get in touch with our counselors. And how to get in touch, you have a form below. You can click on the link given in the form and you can get in touch with our experts. So let's begin with our Hindu analysis for today's newspaper. Now, for today, we have picked three important articles which are to be explained in detail, which can be potentially important for your mains examination as well. And then there are three more articles that we are looking at from the perspective of your prelims examination largely. But also there are some aspects to those articles also which can be important in your mains examination. So let's have a discussion for these all areas. Now the first topic that we have today, this is something that we have picked from the editorial page in today's newspaper, and this is the idea of one nation, one election is against federalism. This is one article that has been published, and author has been talking about certain problems that he thinks could be related to the conduction of one nation, one election. Now, look, when it comes to these kind of topics, and especially when it comes to a topic like this where there will be a lot of debates related to what are the positives and what are the negatives. So you have to understand that you have to be very objective while presenting these points, whether you are looking at all the points in favor and whether you are looking towards all the points which go against these areas. So that's why you have to be very aware and you have to make sure that you are as balanced in your approach as possible. While a lot of editorials may not be so, there might be some editorials which are completely sided in the favor of this concept of one nation, one election, and there are certain articles which will be completely against the idea of one nation, one election. So that's why when you are going on, let's say you are answering a question based on it, you have to be very objective. You have to ensure that you have all the points possible in the favor and against these kind of ideas. Now, first and foremost, let's try to understand that what exactly do we mean by one nation, one election. Now, this is an idea which is being proposed by the government, where the government is suggesting that instead of conducting elections all the time, that there are elections that are happening at the central level every 5 years, and then there are state elections which are also have a very different timetable altogether. And hence what happens is that every time of the year, every year there will be some elections at the state level, and then every 5 years there will be an election at the central level as well, the Lok Sabha elections, that is. So in that scenario, what they are proposing is that instead of having these elections going on all the time, let's have elections which can happen simultaneously, where the elections can happen once a while, and this is where the elections both at the center level, that is Lok Sabha elections, as well as the state assembly elections can happen simultaneously. So this is what the idea of one nation, one election is. Now, there are certain points that are being presented from both the sides, some which are in favor and some which are against. This article largely talks about some of the points which are going against the idea of one nation, one election. So, the context is that there was a high level committee on one nation, one election that was constituted in the month of September. September of last year, that is 2023. And this is where this committee was given the task of understanding all the aspects of conducting one nation, one election, what can go against, what are the positives, what are the negatives, etc. So now, until now, there are three meetings that have been done until now. Two meetings last year and one meeting very recently, this week itself, was conducted. So in this manner, this is the context in which this idea is being presented. Now, before going on to some of the problems that have been also listed out in this particular article, we should also understand some of the aspects of what has been said. So for example, there are a couple of points which have been always presented in the favor of the idea of one nation, one election. And one such always has been the reduced election expenditure. That overall expenditure every time the elections are held, is enormous. And it goes, I mean, for example, let's say for 2014 general elections, if you look at the numbers go beyond 3,000 crore rupees. So that's why this is a huge number that we are looking at. And conducting elections all the time also means that there will be a the total expenditure on these elections will be very, very high. And that's why this is something that is being suggested, that because it can be very expensive affair, we should look at reducing the cost that is being incurred by the government and the political parties in the entire segment or entire conduction of any election. So that's why this is one point that goes in favor as presented by some of the authors. Then after that, minimized policy paralysis, which also is something that is related to the governance downtime, what we also call as governance downtime. So where we are talking about the fact that whenever, let's say, elections are to happen, then before the elections there is something that you might know of, which is called as model code of conduct, right? Model code of conduct will be in place before the elections are to be conducted, when the elections are to be conducted. And in this particular scenario, what happens is that a lot of political decisions, a lot of policy decisions rather, and a lot of governance related decisions are kept on hold whenever the model code of conduct is in place. So because of that, what happens is that there are periods in governance where you are in a standstill. You can say that you are in a standstill, and the government cannot implement any policies at that point of time whenever model code of conduct is in place before the elections. So what is argued in favor of one nation one election is that in these kind of governance downtimes, the number increases when you have these many elections happening, and if the number of election periods decrease, then the governance downtime also decreases. So that's why this is again one point that is always presented in favor of the concept of one nation one election. Then after that, improved governance and efficiency. So overall, what is believed is that if the number of elections and the total time which is given to conduction of elections or before the elections, when the parties are also talking about all the benefits that a certain party would have if they come into power, in these kind of scenarios, what we see is that the politicians and the political parties will be involved a lot in campaigning. They'll be in a campaign mode for a very long time, and that also causes, you can say, in a manner, it also can cause a problem where the focus may not be on governance but rather on the campaigns for a very long time. So that's why this is also something that needs to be understood well, and better policy implementations can happen if there is more focus on governance. Then after that, less disruption to public life and administration, because let's say whenever elections come, and whenever, let's say, 2 months before, 3 months before the election especially, the number of rallies, the number of political events, etc., will start to rise, and that also leads to a total time, a lot of problems for the basic public life, that the roads will be closed, or maybe some kind of disruptions will happen in the normal life and being. And that is also one of the issues that is always seen in terms of the conduction of elections. And then finally, what we see that there are chances of even some controversies being created in some way or the other, whether it is on communal lines or whether it is on caste lines, and these kind of issues can also always, in one way or the other, whether knowingly or unknowingly, come into the fore at the times of elections. So that's why these are all the points which have to be considered when we are looking at some of the points in favor of one nation one election. But at the same time, there are certain issues also that we need to be aware of, that there are a lot of points that go against the notion of one nation one election. That, for example, when we are talking about the logistic challenges, that we know that India is a vast and a diverse country, and in this given scenario, the logistic challenges in the conduction of elections is huge, because overall the resource involvement and the kind of coordination that you need, that is huge right? So resource and resource requirements and the coordination. This can be a huge challenge altogether when we are looking at conducting elections all across the country simultaneously. Similarly, there are chances of even dilution of local issues many a times, that maybe national issues take an upper hand over the local issues, and that's why many a times it may so happen that at a very small scale, at a city level, at the ground level, some of the issues that exist there, they might be overlooked, and the kinds of issues that are more prevalent at a national level might take a hand up. So that's why these are some of the challenges that can actually come up in the terms of uh, the elections, and the entire electoral discourse might always be taken over by the national issues over the local things. Then the impact that we talk about in terms of the federal structure, and this is also something that has been discussed in this particular article as well, that this is where a lot of problems can be created on the basis of the federal lines, because we need to understand that the entire concept of the division of powers between the center and the state, and how center and state, they all have their own constitutional powers, might also dilute in one way or the other. And that's why there are certain issues that can come up, and that's why there are legal challenges also that are being talked about with regards to what can happen in these kind of situations. So in, well, let's say when it comes to any state or versus the center, we do not know whether or how exactly the coordination needs to happen in these kind of situations, and that can also have some kind of problem, some kind of uh, you can say an undermining of the federal structure can also happen potentially in these kind of situations. Then there is a risk of prolonged central and state government vacancies as well, that many a times the new appointments and everything is also related to the elections, and the appointments will happen after a new government comes into the scenario. So in this kind of a situation, a very complex scenario might arise in these kind of situations, and it might lead to situations where we might see that there will be prolonged periods where, let's say, the appointments have not happened because there is a waiting time before the new elections might happen. So that's why in terms of, especially when it comes to let's say a center or a state governments, if it falls midterm, then the new appointments will have to wait, and we do not know what exactly is the time period of waiting in these kind of scenarios. And then after that, when it comes to, there is another way to look at the voter engagement also, that one point that we are seeing is that fine, there might be disruption to public life, there might be disruptions to governance, etc., but at the same time what we might also see is that there might be a big interval between the elections, right? There is a big interval between the elections that we are about to see, and that will also make the engagement, the electoral engagement with the public altogether, might also uh, see a gap in communication, not rather a miscommunication, and because of that they might not be aware of the policies and the policy uh, communications that happen from time to time, that also might lack in its nature. So what may happen is that, let's say, in any new government policies, any new initiatives, etc., may see a big gap, or maybe it will happen only before and after the elections, and the midterms in between, let's say the second, the third year and the fourth year between the elections, might not see that much of interest from the electoral perspectives from the side of the governments as well. So that is also one of the issues. And then it might have a major impact on the smaller regional parties. They might start to lose their relevance in one way or the other, because first and foremost, they might not be able to compete with the national level parties in terms of the election campaigns and the scale at which the national parties might be able to operate, and that might also have a negative impact on these kind of situations. So that's why we have to understand that there are both the aspects to it, that there are positives and the negatives that we need to understand from the perspective of one nation, one election. But just remember that this is a concept that is very often in the news now, because now there is a committee also that has been set up. So going forward, this is going to be a very, very important topic, especially for your mains examination. Another topic that has been in the news, and again something that has been in controversies as well: why was FCRA registration for several NGOs cancelled? Now, again, when we look at the FCRA registrations, this also has been in the news for some time now. Because in this particular scenario, what we are looking at is that there are NGOs whose registrations have been cancelled, and because of some of the fundings that have been received by these NGOs, they have not been seen as positive, they have been seen in a negative light. So that also is this is one of the problems, and that's why we have seen that this has been in the news for some time now. That we have seen that the government also, especially the Ministry of Home Affairs, this is something, the ministry looks after all the FCRA related rules. So FCRA related rules basically are related for regulating the foreign donations for the non-government organizations or the NGOs. Now this is basically aimed as ensuring that the foreign contributions that come to the NGOs, they do not negatively impact a country's internal security. And that's why all the NGOs which are receiving funds under the FCRA, they have to ensure that they are making sure that it is not going to be used in any activity that goes against the internal security, and it may not cause any problem for the security of the country. So that is something that has been in the news. Now what has happened is that there have been certain changes and updates in the rules, and since COVID-19 we have seen that there have been challenges here. That first there was COVID-19, and then the rule changes. Now because of the changes in the rules and COVID-19 pandemic both at the same time, many of the NGOs could not file for these registrations on time, and then after that we saw that there was some extensions also that were provided by the ministry. That first it was extended to 2021, and then later multiple times it has been extended, and the last extension has been given until March 31st of 2024. Now when it comes to the foreign contributions which are regulated under the FCRA rules, what we have to understand that many a times they are very, very crucial, because they help in various activities. For example, they may include social, educational, religious, economic or cultural programs. Now overall the registrations that are happening, these registrations are valid for 5 years of time, and in these 5 years of time all these registrations, all these fundings also, they have to be regulated. Now overall when it comes to the FCRA, the controversy that has been here has been around a couple of companies whose registrations have been cancelled, and these two registrations that have been cancelled, the companies, or rather the NGOs also, they have spoken up. But overall we see that there are certain issues that the government has flagged, and because of that their registrations were cancelled. So now when it comes to the FCRA registrations, what we need to understand is mainly about the FCRA and what FCRA exactly does, and how FCRA becomes very, very crucial in this particular scenario. Now overall when it comes to FCRA, there are certain aspects of FCRA with regards to the roles that it has, the objectives that it has. So for example, the very first thing is always about the registration, that every NGO will have to the organizations that need to that want the funding under FCRA, they would have to register as a part of FCRA, and then after that they would have to, and if let's say they are not somebody who are already associated with it or already not, if they are not already eligible, then they can also take a prior permission and they can get these fundings under the FCRA. And then when it comes to the utilization of fund, this is where they have to ensure that utilization of fund is being done for the objectives that have been laid out, and the funds are not being either mismanaged or the funds are not being diverted towards something else. It's not that they have listed something as their objectives for using these funds and they are using these funds for entirely different, something different. And this is where some of the NGOs have been flagged by the government, that the NGOs have not been using, as per some of the reports, the NGOs have not been using those funds as per the requirement and as per the objectives. So that's why this is something that is very, very crucial, and this is where it comes to the monitoring and the reporting of the funds that are received, because there will be annual fiscal statements also that have to be laid out by the NGOs into showcasing what all the funds were received, what kind of funds were received, and where the funds were used. So all these have to be done, and then there will be reasonable restrictions also that have been put. So all the controversies that happen, they basically are here with regards to the restriction on the usage and where to be used and where you should not use. So for example, anything that any fund that goes in the activities which might be in one way or the other dangerous for country's sovereignty or dangerous for country's integrity or challenges the integrity of the country, in these kind of cases these funds will always be restricted in usage. And this is where a lot of penalties also have been laid out in terms of what can be used and where the funds have to be used, and this is where it can even lead to the cancellation of the funds. So that's why we have to understand the perspective of FCRA and the use of FCRA in these kind of scenarios, because when it comes to the registration under FCRAs, what we have seen is that a total of, when it comes to the total foreign contribution that has come to the government of India, this is something that they have said that a total of 13,520 associations received a total of 55,741.5 crore rupees in foreign contributions in the last 3 years. So this is the number that has been given, and there was a 2012 report also that was published by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and this report is very, very crucial from the perspective that in the country, the report says that there are more than 20 lakh NGOs that have been registered, and out of those registered NGOs, there are only about 2% of these NGOs which are receiving funds under FCRA. So overall, when it comes to these NGOs, the government also said that we should not make, the report also said that we should not make a generalization that whether the funds are being misused or are being used in activities that goes against the integrity of the nation. But there are cases where money laundering issues have come forward. The use of funds even in activities which are very closely running to the terrorist activities also have been pointed out in certain cases. So that's why there are all these things that always have to, because of which they always say that they have to ensure the checks and balances in case of the FCRA registrations. So that's why there are all these issues which again in terms of FCRA has been in the news. Now the third article that we have right here, this is intersectionality of gender and caste in women's participation in labor force. Now, when it comes to this article, this is a very important article from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Social Justice, and this is where some of the very important points have been listed out by the authors in a paper that was published very recently in the Economic and Political Weekly. And based on that paper that was published there, this article points out some of the key areas that have been listed. Now we have to understand that when it comes to this article, first and foremost, what exactly is it talking about? It is talking about something which is called as labor force participation. labor force participation. So what we mean by labor force participation, first of all, basically this is where we are talking about the number of people who are aged 16 and above, who are employed or actively seeking employment, and divided by the total number of non-institutionalized civil working age group population. That basically number of people, the total labor force that is working in the country, is called as the labor force participation rate. Now this labor force participation becomes a very key indicator of how exactly the economic activities are being conducted in the country, and what is the ratio of, let's say, formal to informal sectors, the male to the female ratio of the participation, and all these things become very important indicators to also understand where we lack and where we need to improve. And one of those points has been picked up in this particular article, where they are talking about especially the women workforce, the female workforce, and especially the problems that are faced by the women workforce who come from a lower caste background, or maybe they come from a background which is having some kind of gender bias. So there are two problems that they have listed out. The first problem is the gender bias against the women workforce, and then second, the caste bias, which sometimes also comes into the labor force, in especially in women participation. So there are these two aspects that they have picked up. What are the issues and what are the solutions? What are the things to look forward to? What is the way forward for this? So overall, when it comes to women participation, first thing that we need to also understand is that there is some kind of gender disparity also that we look at when we look at the labor force participation. So for example, when you look at the case in India, when you look at the labor force participation percentage, the male to female ratio, if you look at some of the other countries that we have taken as an example, you would see that the ratio is one of the lowest in case of India as compared to some of the other countries which are also considered as the developing economies. So this is one issue when it comes to the gender disparity. This is something that we know of. So this is, and especially if you also look at the data with regards to South Asia in general, not only in India but other South Asian countries as well, you'll find that the ratio between the disparity between the male and the female labor force participation is the highest when it comes to the South Asian countries compared to any other part of the globe. So that's why this is a gender parity that is pretty much visible in every report and every study that is being conducted by conducted all across. So overall, that's why this becomes a very crucial aspect of for us to also understand that there is this gender disparity in the labor force, especially among when it comes to the Indian women. Now overall, what the article also says is that over the past 2 decades, India has seen a notable reduction in the female labor force participation. And overall, what happens is that especially when it comes to the informal sector, where we see that the disparity is even higher as compared to the formal sector. So in the informal sector, the disparity is higher. Now it also tries to understand why exactly is this disparity higher in terms of informal sector as compared to the formal sector. So overall, there are two major things that they have talked about. That one, there is a gender bias, and then there is a caste bias as well. So there are two major reasons because of which there has been a smaller female participation in the labor force as compared to the male counterparts. Now overall, when we look at the decline, what we have understood is that especially when it comes to the female labor force participation in the informal sector, it tends to increase in the areas which have higher proportion of lower caste households, and in the region where female headed households, especially in these economic if these are economically disadvantaged. So overall, these two aspects they have highlighted, that when you have a higher proportion of lower caste versus a high and also female headed households, these are areas where they have seen that the informal economy tends I mean the labor force participation tends to increase in for female. So wherever you do not have these, let's say whenever you have a lower population of lower caste, this is where you see that there is a lower participation, and whenever you have patriarchal households, there also the female participation is lower. And you also have to understand that these, when it comes to any household which is patriarchal in its nature, uh, the males of the households would probably be the earners in general. So that also many a times what happens is that it pushes women only towards household activities and looking after the family, etc. So then in that case their participation in economic activities decreases. But if it is a female headed household and the participation, or the, let's say, the number of females in the household is more, then in that case, because of, let's say, the revenue generation activities that they have to be involved in, the number of workforce participation will increase from these kind of households. So long story short, what we are saying is that if it's a patriarchal household, the chances of female labor participation is low, and if it is a female headed household, then chances of female participation in the workforce will be higher. This is the first thing. And the second thing is that the when it comes to a higher proportion of lower caste in areas where you have higher proportion of lower caste, there also we have seen that female participation in the labor force increases. So these are two things. Now overall, when it comes to the decline, they obviously have been talking about, and something that you are aware of, just that these are things being put into words, that women are, the barriers come especially from the societal perspectives, the societal expectations, that they are always let's say uh, believed to be or expected to be involved more in housework, more in taking care of the family. And then apart from that, there have been certain legal constraints and economic limitations also in seeking the employment. So for example, let's say when we talk about legal constraints, in the work areas which are very high in labor requirement, in very high in physical requirements, women are normally not the participants there. At the same time, many of the legal constraints are also let's say in terms of night shifts, etc., where it is deemed to be unsafe for women, and hence their participation decreases there. And legally many of the companies and organizations would not allow women to get into these kind of jobs. So legally they are restricted there. Households and the work in the households also restrict them, and at the same time there are certain economic limitations also that will also not let them get employment or seek employment in the sector. Then at the same time, especially when it comes to the informal sector, women are less hindered by the patriarchal constraints and find their employment opportunities more readily, especially in the female headed households. So female headed households that require income, then in that case what we see is that female participation in the economic activities will rise. But if it is a patriarchal household where the males of the house are already earning a lot, then we might see that their participation in the economic activities will start to drop. And then when it comes to especially to the lower caste women, what we have seen is that their participation in the workforce is largely dictated by the economic necessities and limited social mobility. And because of this, what we have seen is that often because of lack of education, we see that their predominance has been in the informal sector. And education at a point is also related to their participation in the formal sector. That what we have seen is that women, for example, what this also says, I mean this article also talks about that in the households where the women are educated, chances are higher that they would also try to get employment in the formal sector, and especially they would try to get their employment in the government jobs. For example, let's say when we are talking about a caste based bias, in that case it also has mentioned, the article also talks about the fact that whenever you have females, lower caste females who are educated, have a higher chance of trying to seek government jobs because they also understand their opportunity in terms of reservations as well. So that's why they would tend to go towards that, and that also is something that some of the studies have conducted, as the article notes. So that's why education is directly related to what the labor force participation will be in the formal and the informal sectors. That in the formal sectors, the participation of lower caste females will be higher when they are educated, and in the informal sector it will be higher when they are not educated. So that's why these are some of the points that they have talked about. So essentially it also talks about what could help. We have to understand that if these are some of the issues that we are talking about, what are the potential ways in which we can get some results in the positive direction. So first and foremost, we need affirmative action policies that can help in entry of the female workforce into the formal sector more, and especially when it comes to the public sector jobs, we have to understand that education plays a big role in getting them through. And then at the same time, we have to also understand that when it comes to the female participation, it has been observed that when the female participation in economic activities in any household is good, it also leads to a better societal improvement, better improvement in the household also, better chances of female education also. That if a mother is educated, chances are higher that the female child will also be educated. If the mother is not educated, it has been linked with lower education rates or lower even literacy rates in the female children of the household. So that's why there are all these issues also that we need to understand, that why women education becomes important, because it will have a generational positive impact on that entire household, and it will lead to higher levels of education also in those areas or in those households. So that's why that also becomes very crucial. And then at the same time, it helps in women empowerment altogether. And once it helps in women empowerment, we do see that they have a better understanding of the correct age for childbirth, correct age for marriage, increasing the likelihood of children's education, really reducing the susceptibility to domestic violence, and at the same time enhancing their mobility as well. As one of the points that I had mentioned, that female mobility in lower caste decreases if education levels are also low. So that's why we have to understand all these points. I understand when you look at all these perspectives, there are certain things that you already understand, but these two important things that what you have to take as key points from here is that, one, from the perspective of gender bias, and second, from the perspective of caste bias, what are the problems that female labor force participation faces. Because when you look at the data, in India with regards to the disparity between male and female labor force participation, plus the disparity that we have seen in general in India, or let's say South Asia as an entire region, we have seen that the disparity is higher. So that's why we need to understand what are the key issues and what are the ways in which these can be improved. Now, these are the three bigger articles. Let's also look at some of the other articles that we have in today's newspaper. One of this is about the Chinese interference, and this is again something that you have very often come across. I'm sure that you are already aware of these topics, but understand what's happening. What we see here now is that there is a new development, that Chinese vessels now are headed towards Mali, and there is a specific Chinese vessel that it has been talking about, which is Jiang Yang Hong 03. So this particular vessel is what is being mentioned in this particular article, and the fact that it is moving towards the Indian Ocean region. Now, when it comes to the Indian Ocean region, we have to understand that the influence of China here has been increasing. That overall, what we have seen is that if you understand the Indian Ocean region, these are some of the key players here. Now, when you look at them, when you look at all these areas, you understand that India and China, these two countries have been trying to have a good influence over the Indian Ocean region. There are some areas which are tilted more towards China. There are some areas which are tilted more towards India. But China has been very aggressively trying to improve upon its influence in the Indian Ocean region in one way or the other. So that's why when you look at all these areas, we understand that whether it is the Pakistan port, whether it is about the Sri Lankan ports, or even in Maldives, because of now the issues between India and Maldives, we have seen that the closeness between China, or especially from the side of China, they have been very aggressively trying to push towards more Chinese participation in Maldives. So there are all these things that they have been doing. At the same time, we see that there are other countries which are closer to India. For example, when you talk about Mauritius or Madagascar, there the Indian presence is better. So overall, we see that there are all these things, and we talk about something called a string of pearls in terms of Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean region, which can be dangerous for India, because it can lead to a situation where they would influence their they would increase their influence in this region, and slowly and steadily they have been trying to get in touch with all the island nations in these areas, and they are trying to increase their influence. So that's why overall this is something that we have to be aware of, and because from the perspective of India's international relations with its neighbors, not only the land neighbors but also with respect to the maritime neighbors, we have to understand the influence and how we need to also ensure that these things do not go in the favor of China altogether, because it's also not only about the international relations that we maintain. Security perspective obviously always comes into the picture, but also at the same time it also depletes us from getting some of the resources that are there in the Indian Ocean. So getting a cooperation or having cooperations between these island nations also helps us in getting some of these resources and trying to have an influence in all these aspects. So that's why we have to look into this scenario, and again something that has been developing as a part of the entire discussion. Now, one more topic that we have is about Jammu CSIR lab finds cannabis compound that has an antibiotic effect. Now, when it comes to antibiotic effects, we see that very often now you will find that there is one article or the other which in one way or the other talks about the antibiotic resistance, and this is again one article which is related to antibiotic resistance itself, because overall when it comes to antibiotic resistance, this is where the number of cases of antibiotic resistance has been increasing. And in India, for example, one of the estimates says that there have been 2.97 lakh deaths in 2019 which are related to only antibiotic resistance. So now these numbers are increasing, and when it comes to the situation of antibiotic resistance, it is going to have a further problem. Now what we see is that they have been able to find certain antibiotic properties in some of the cannabis, and they are trying to understand whether or not they can be influential in combating the antibiotic resistance. Now what we need to understand here is that it's not only about one plant or the other and how the plant can be useful, etc., but largely what are the ways in which antibiotic resistance is increasing its footprint, and what are the steps that we can take in decreasing that. Very recently, another article that was in the news was about the fact that the government also has now laid out regulations in a manner that making prescriptions even more mandatory than they used to be for a lot of antibiotics, so that over the counter sale of drugs should not happen without valid prescriptions. But unfortunately we have seen that this is also something which is related to the habits altogether that we have. A very wrong healthcare seeking behavior has been observed here in case of Indians at large or in general population across the world. But in India we have seen that there has been a very casual approach in regards to how exactly we are taking these antibiotics. So for example, overuse of antibiotics, taking antibiotics without consulting a doctor, just going to, we all probably do this, that without going to the doctor we simply just Google it maybe, or maybe we just directly go to the shop and we just tell them the symptoms. They are also experts, they will also give you the medicines. So unfortunately these kind of behaviors are very bad for the health, and it can lead to the occurrence of antibiotic resistance. So first and foremost, when we say that something is antibiotic resistance, understand the meaning. That when we say that there is something called as antibiotic resistance or antimicrobial resistance, it means that the microbe or the pathogen has now developed a resistance against a certain drug or a medicine that was used against them. So any medicine that you were using now will become ineffective, because the bacteria or any pathogen for that matter now has developed a resistance against this medicine, against this drug. So now those drugs become ineffective. So now the problem starts, because the medication that you are supposed to take against a certain medicine, against a certain disease, will not be effective anymore. And that creates the problem. So now what we see is one of the major problems has been misuse of drugs. One of the major problems has been misuse of drugs, and at the same time overuse of drugs, or overuse of especially antibiotics. Now what also has been happening is that the uh, antibiotics that we have available, altogether the availability has become easier. It's not only the fact that you can go to a shop and there are so many medical shops that are available all across your place, but at the same time now online selling of drugs is also happening. So online selling of drugs many a times can also may not look for a valid prescription, and without a valid prescription they might give you the medicine. So in that scenario what happens is that when, let's say, these outlets or the online platforms or the companies, they are trying to increase their revenue more than looking towards the ethical and the proper behavior in healthcare seeking activities, this is something that can lead to a lot of issues as well. And that's why we see that there are so many regulations being brought in, not only by the government of India, but also at the same time WHO also has been working very effectively in making sure that these kind of behavior can be changed. So a lot is also about education, a lot is also about making people understand what can go wrong and what they need to do to ensure a proper healthcare seeking behavior. They need to understand how severe the scenarios can be. Everyone has seen COVID-19 and what can happen when a virus is able to attack your body and immune system is not able to respond to it, and when there is no drug that works against it. Similar is a case of any antibiotic resistance, because antibiotic resistance means that the medicines are not effective. So once the disease has happened, even if you take the medicines, it is not going to have any effect. One of the major cases that we have seen in India has been of tuberculosis, where the number of cases of tuberculosis were rising, where the normal vaccines or normal drugs taken against tuberculosis was not effective. Two important strains here, one was called as MDR-TB and another one was called as XDR-TB. These are two which were seen to be completely where we saw that the medications were completely ineffective in acting against these diseases. So that's why we have to understand that there are all these things that we need to ensure and understand, and that's why it is also about the our healthcare seeking behavior. So that's why these articles directly are not very important from the examination perspective. Only one fact about what they have found and against what bacteria they have found it. That's it. So the name of the compound, that this is the compound and this is going to be helpful in acting against a certain bacteria. That's it. So knowing that much is going to be more than enough for you, and you don't have to do anything beyond that. But largely this topic altogether is more important from your examination perspective. Then the last topic of the day, with no iron or steel, Ayodhya temple is a study in sandstone. Now what we basically see is that this article talks about some of the basic aspects of the temple and what are the things that they have done in the temple to ensure the longevity of the temple, and this is precisely what it is talking about. Now more than anything, what I would say is that the temple style becomes very, very crucial, because this temple style, you can say that in a manner, uh, it's a traditional Nagara style of architecture, and this is a kind of architecture that was largely seen in the North Indian temples of the ancient times. So those kind of architectural styles are pretty much visible when it comes to this temple that has been inaugurated yesterday. Now, when it comes to the Ayodhya temple, some of the basics you can see. I mean, I would suggest that you can just go through this part, which can give you the entire idea about what exactly are they saying and what are the various aspects of the things that are there in the temple. But overall, just remember that when it comes to the temple, it is a Nagara style of temple architecture. So just now what happens is that not only the Nagara style of architecture, but also the Dravidian style of architecture and even the Visara style of architecture can become important from prelims perspective, and the aspects of it and all the characteristics that you have of all these temple styles from the ancient to the medieval times, they can become important from your prelims perspective. So that is basically what you have to do in terms of this one article with regards to the Ayodhya temple. Now, two questions from the mains perspective based on what discussions we did today. First is on the basis of one nation, one election. Analyze the concept of one nation, one election in the context of Indian democracy. Discuss the potential impact on the political, administrative, and social fabric of India. Critically evaluate the advantages and challenges associated with its implementation. So as you can see that there are three parts to this question that you have to answer on, and total word limit is 250 words. So overall you will give a basic introduction first, alright, basic introduction to what this concept of one nation, one election is. Do not go beyond 30 to 40 words in this particular part, and then the potential impact that it can have on the political, administrative, and the social fabric of India. This is where you can list down some of the points with regards to the advantages and the disadvantages, and you can very easily give let's say 50 to 60 words easily on both the aspects. And overall you have to give a way forward altogether, because you, as I told you, that in these kind of questions you have to take a very balanced approach. Try not to take sides, whether for or against. Try to present all the points as objectively as possible with examples if you can. So that is what you have to do, that take 60-70 words, let's say, for positives, and same 60-70 words for the negatives, and then you have to give a proper conclusion with regards to what are the things that we can look forward to, and if you have talked about some of the issues, then what are the ways in which those issues can be overcome. So these are the things that you have to do in this question. And then lastly, the second question: examine the factors influencing labor force participation in India with special focus on the gender and caste dynamics. Discuss the implications of these factors on India's socio-economic fabric and suggest measures that can be taken to improve women's participation in the workforce, especially in the informal sector. So again, a 250 word answer. Now, when it comes to this, first it will be a basic definition that you have to give, what we had started our discussion with. So introduction plus definition here should not again take more than 30 to 40 words. You have to restrict yourself there. And then after that, you have to talk about special focus on gender and caste dynamics. So there are two aspects that were even discussed in that article. So that has to be brought in here. And then after that, the factors, implications of these factors on India's socio-economic fabric and measures that can be taken to improve. So first you have to talk about the implications of the factors. So implications of the factors and all these issues that we had discussed about, what are the problems that we had discussed as per the article, and then what are the way forward, what are the things that we can do in the making sure of improvement in women's participation with special focus on the informal sector. What can be done to improve the informal sector participation of the women with regards to labor force participation. So these are the things, and again something that already we have discussed in as a part of the article, right? So this brings us to the end of today's discussion with regards to the Hindu newspaper. Please go back and once again revise it. All the important areas plus some of the important areas from the articles also that we discussed. Please go back and also have a look at all these articles. So with that, let me end the session for today. Thank you very much for joining.